Sounds good. I'm just sharing my screen now, so I'll pull up the talk. Okay, so you should be able to see my first slide. Sam sends his regrets that he couldn't join us this morning. I know you were looking forward to hearing from him, as was I, but he just couldn't make it. Sam Wilson is our carnivore and fur bearer program manager. But he did have some slide material that I've gotten from him in the past, so I've incorporated that into my talk today. And I also want to thank Sarah Nevison, our natural legacy biologist. She sent me some slides as well that I could use this morning. So I did pull this together relatively quickly from information we had on hand and from my familiarity with the project. Some of the questions that you may have, very detailed research questions, although I have a broad overview of the project, I may not know some of those specifics, but still feel free to bring up those questions because we can always get those to Sam and he can help us answer those later. So the title of the talk is The Successful Restoration of River Otters in Nebraska. And I wanted to just start this morning sharing with you my first experience with a wild river otter. It was shortly after I had moved to Nebraska from out of state, and it was an early morning. I was dropping off a Game and Parks vehicle along the lower Platte River because there were researchers that were going to be traveling down the river doing least turn and piping plover surveys for the day, and they were going to need a vehicle to pull their transport their kayaks back. So I was driving by myself, dropping off the truck, and you know, it was probably about a half hour after sunrise. It was a beautiful summer morning. I got out, kind of sat down along the bank, just sort of taking in the scenery and the smells and sounds of the morning. And the water was pretty calm, and I saw something swimming, you know, out there, and it started to get closer. I hadn't had a chance to get my binoculars out yet. They were still in my bag. But I just sort of sat still there waiting to see what it was, and it came in closer, and sure enough, it was a river otter, and I was super excited. I had seen river otters in captivity before, either at zoos or nature centers, and, you know, had watched them for hours. So I was familiar with, you know, how they looked, their size, their movements, and without a doubt, it was a river otter. And so I was just super excited to see it. It did come in fairly close. I don't think it really noticed me at first. But then there was that moment, you know, where eyes meet, and I sort of froze, stood still, not sure how it would react. I didn't want to scare it away. It realized I was probably something to be afraid of, and it dove down in the water, and I didn't see it again. So it was just a fun experience, and I'm sure you can think of times where you've had those sort of close encounters with wildlife, and that sort of second frozen in time where the animal's figuring out what it's going to do and you're figuring out what you should do. So it was just my first experience seeing one, and I haven't seen a wild one since. So it can happen when you least expect it. So what I'm going to talk about today with the river otter, I'm going to go over briefly its characteristics, why it was listed in the state of Nebraska, and its repatriation or reintroduction into the state and what that involved, monitoring and research of the species, and what we've done for the delisting process. And then I'm also going to share where you can see otters in our state. Okay. So the river otter weighs between 10 and 30 pounds. The males are slightly bigger than the females. They can grow somewhere typically between 3 to 4 feet long, and that includes the length of their, you know, strong muscular tail, which helps them to be excellent swimmers. They have very streamlined bodies. And you can find river otters in rivers, creeks, wetlands. They're considered an aquatic species, and they're opportunistic carnivores. So they're gonna eat what they can find, whether it be, you know, fish, crayfish, frogs, aquatic animals that make up most of their protein source. So if you're out and about in wondering, is that a river otter I'm looking at? You can look at these 4 pictures I have up on the screen and kind of think about, you know, which one looks the most like a river otter if you had to guess. So let's go through and see what we've got here. So we have a mink, and then a beaver, a muskrat, and there is our river otter in the bottom right corner. So you can see how the river otter, you're mostly just seeing its head. Its body is mostly below the surface of the water. But yeah, if you have binoculars and can get a good look at it, definitely try to see them when you can, because they are pretty stealthy. So its range is throughout much of North America. So these, when I say range, these are places where it wouldn't be highly unusual to see them if there's a stream or body of water nearby. But they are not typically found in great numbers in a lot of these locations. So in terms of the background of the river otter, it was densely populated throughout most of United States and North America until the early 1900s. And then it started to lose habitat, and that was because the rivers and wetlands that it depended upon were being changed. And at the time, trapping for their fur, it was unregulated. And so without those regulations, they were over-harvested. Because of this, they were extirpated from most of the states, except Louisiana and Alaska. And in 1986, we listed it as endangered in Nebraska. So it was not federally endangered, but the state has the ability to list species as either threatened or endangered. And when we did this, that prohibited the trapping, and it also allowed us to become more eligible for additional funding and prioritized reintroducing or repatriating the species in our state, so returning it to its home waters. So this whole process began shortly after the listing in 1986. And there were various rivers chosen for releases. This was based upon the habitat availability that was there, historical range, and of course where we would have access. So that was along the Platte, the Niobrara, South Loop, Elkhorn, Calamus, and Cedar. So 6 sites, 6 rivers, and then there were 7 release sites. And as they were released during those years, in the late 80s into the 90s, the stars are the sites where the releases took place. And then we started to already see an expansion, and those are those little red circles you see on the map in front of you, where otters were being sighted. So in addition to these releases, we wanted to monitor them and conduct some research. And so one of the ways that was done was through bridge surveys, where researchers go out on these bridges over waterways, and from there they can get a good look at any sign of otters, whether it's the animal itself, whether it's tracks. They leave tracks, of course, with their feet, but also they slide in the snow, and so you can see those types of tracks. From 2006 to 2011, there was a telemetry study, and so this would tell us information about the otter's home range, what habitats it was using, and also if those individuals being released were surviving. From 2009 to 2011, there was a DNA density study done, and this gave an estimate of the numbers along the Platte River. And then more recently, 2014 to 2016, there was a project undertaken by Nathan Bieber, a graduate student in the Nebraska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, to get a better handle on its distribution in the state. So as you can see in the photo in the snow there, those are what the tracks would look like as researchers were out trying to see signs of otters. They will slide in the snow to help them get around. And if we have time later, I'll play a little video of that. And then there was sometimes incidental trapping. And so although they were protected or are still protected from trapping, occasionally one does find its way into a trap, and as long as that trapper turns the specimen reports it and turns it into the Game and Parks Commission, they're not penalized for that. And it also helps us to keep track of where these otters are moving throughout the state, and it gives us a sense of how many and how well they may be doing. And you can see just an example of where a bridge survey would be conducted in that lower photo. So with the telemetry study, Sam Wilson led that up, and that was able, as I mentioned before, to tell us more information about where the otters were going and their survivability. We partnered with the Game and Parks Commission, and Sam partnered with a veterinarian who helped to insert those transmitters. And you can see an example of what it would look like to get out there and track a river otter and the types of maps we could produce from that information. So that repatriation effort went till 1992. During that time, over 150 river otters were released back into their home waters, and we tracked their movements. There was the genetic testing piece, and I hadn't mentioned yet the scat collection. So that's where that genetic information, the material that was used to get that information, and then searching for river otter presence. So from that study, we were able to find out that river otters are expanding within Nebraska. Their survival is very high. The open water habitats are the ones that appear to be the most important to them. And for that Platte River study, the density was very high, 1 per kilometer. And so that, it's important to note, with that project, that was the highest on record in the United States. So doing way better than we expected from the returning them to Nebraska. So just go into a little bit of Nathan Bieber's work that had begun in 2015. He was surveying Nebraska rivers, and again, this was to create a better distribution map of the species within our state. He looked along the Platte, Niobrara, Loup, Elkhorn, Missouri, Big Blue, and Republican rivers. He did this by kayak. He and other observers would record all otter signs detected while kayaking the river. And even though he was out, very often, yes, he found plenty of signs of otter, but actually seeing an individual animal, I think, I can't remember the exact number he saw, but I want to say it was only like 1 or 2. So it just gives you a sense of the signs were out there, but they are very stealthy and secretive, so it can be hard to see in person unless you know where to look and you have a little bit of luck too. So he focused on areas of high detection probability and where he was seeing more of the tracks. So this included vegetated sandbars, the creek inlets, and peninsula cutoffs. And a couple of photos there give you examples of locations where he was finding signs of otter. And another, I'm not sure how heavily he got into this piece of it, but deploying cameras, so remote sensing cameras that he could use in areas that couldn't be surveyed by kayak. And he has since graduated, and his thesis is available, as well as 1 or 2 publications that could give you details of that project. So from his work, he prepared multiple distribution models so that we would have a better sense of not only where otters, currently were occurring, but also places that offer great potential for habitat. He based his models on 190 different observations of otter signs. So those otter signs, again, would be the various types of tracks they would leave or scat. And then 380 historical records were built into his modeling effort. So if we look at the current range in Nebraska based on Nathan's work and Sam's work and the data that we had in that analysis, we see that the range of river otters in our state expanded greatly from those 7 locations where they were originally reintroduced. And so those auto releases again are indicated with those red dots.
Hi, Melissa, we have 3 minutes.
Okay, great. So they're expanding. They're in most major waterways. They're recovered in Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas. And so we started this effort to downlist them from endangered to threatened in Nebraska in 2000. So they became, that downlisting was a great step in the right direction. And in 2018, we proposed to remove them from the threatened list in Nebraska because all of this information is telling us they have recovered in our state. So we go through a detailed process to add or remove species from our threatened and endangered list. We have to follow the Nebraska Non-Game and Endangered Species Conservation Act of 1975. And so we undertook an official update to our threatened and endangered list in 2018 because the prior update hadn't been completed since 2000. So there's a number of steps we have to follow. We don't just choose, yes, we want to add this species, take this species off. We've got to collect all the information, prepare proposals that have to go out for scientific peer review. We have to notify our governor, governors of surrounding states, provide notice to other state agencies, provide notice to all of the natural resource districts, public power districts. If that species is part of their management area, we have to hold public hearings in each commissioner's district, a public comment period that must be at least 60 days. Ours was well over a year. And then we hold a final hearing for those proposed regulation changes. So this happened August 28th, just recently, and the commissioners approved the delisting of the river otter. But we're not quite done yet because it goes to the Attorney General's office, then to the governor's office, and then with final approval from the governor, it is then filed with the Secretary of State. So that's where we're at right now. We do have the commissioner's support for delisting the river otter in our state. If we look at surrounding states, it's secure east of us, not doing as great west. It's still a species of greatest conservation need there. South Dakota, though, it changed just since this process started, and they just removed it from their threatened list, the river otter, in May 2020. So why? From extirpated to nearly statewide in 30 years. This is really what success in wildlife management looks like. So we couldn't be happier with how the river otter is doing in our state. This was 3 decades in the making, an unprecedented conservation success story. And we have to thank, of course, the private landowners involved, the Cooperative Research Unit, TNC, Nebraska Fur Harvesters, and other organizations. So these are places you can go to find river otter. You can look for those signs in the winter. If you're out kayaking or canoeing, paddling Nebraska's rivers, keep an eye out for them. And Monica, can I play the video for everybody what the river otter does in the snow?
Sure, please do.
Okay, here we go. This is just the various groups to acknowledge and individuals that were involved in this research. And so I realize I'm out of time for talking to all of you, but I do want to be able to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, type away in the chat. And Monica, I can't see the chat right now, so if you could read to me, that would be wonderful.